So scientists have never found material, and that's clear. Scientists have never found materials. But scientists have measured physical properties of materials and established physical laws that seems to work, at least in the four-dimensional world that we perceive the world. So how is that tied to the consciousness model, if I can call it that way?
Well, the physical objects that they're measuring and the measurements all take place in their minds. How do you know that the measurements they are taking are not a reflection of the limitations of their own mind? How do you know that those measurements pertain to the object and they are not simply the limitations of the mind through which they are perceiving that object? Maybe those measurements are reflections of the limitations of the mind, not the nature of stuff called matter. How do we know? Because those measurements are appearances in the mind. Therefore, they must be subject to the limitations of the mind in which they appear. If a creature with a five-dimensional mind were to measure the same object, do you think it would come up with the same measurements? No, it would come up with different measurements. Why? Because it would, the object, the limitations of its own mind or the characteristics of its own mind would be reflected in the measurements that it was taking. How do scientists know that they are measuring matter and not measuring the limitations of their own mind? They don't. They are measuring the limitations of their own mind and projecting them onto matter.
And when they build bridges and airplanes and iPhones and whatever they build based on the measurements that they have taken and the physical laws that they understand, how do we tie that? And people go and sit on an airplane and use the iPhone.
This is why the matter-only model has gained so much credence in our world culture. Precisely, you've put your finger on it. It's because of the success of science that science has had building airplanes and bridges and computers, and that is seen as an incontrovertible it seems to legitimize the matter-only model because it's so effective at such practical matters. I'm not saying that these laws are wrong. I'm just saying that we should upgrade them from laws of matter to laws of mind. They still work. Mind still operates, as we said a couple of days ago, mind still operates through, it still needs to follow patterns. The unfolding of mind in consciousness, mind unfolds in consciousness through a series of patterns or habits. Why couldn't the laws of nature ultimately be the laws that govern the way mind unfolds in consciousness? Those laws could still be predictable. They could even be measurable. So I'm not saying that, I'm not denying the validity of these measurements or these laws. I'm just upgrading them from matter to mind.
But again, it will have to assume that different minds are coming up with the same measurement and the same laws.
Say that again.
It will have to assume that different minds coming up with the same measurements and the same laws.
That's because these different minds are informed by the same consciousness. The materialist thinks that the reason why we come up with the same measurements and the same laws is because different minds observe the same world. But could it not also be the case that different minds come up with the same measurements and the same laws because they are informed by the same consciousness? So the consciousness-only model can explain why scientists come up with measurements, why different scientists, different people come up with the same measurements, the same observations. The consciousness-only model can explain that without recourse to believing in something outside our experience called matter. So I'm not denying the existence of these laws. I'm not denying the similarities between observations. I'm just giving them a different interpretation, and an interpretation that is in line with our experience, an interpretation that doesn't have to imagine a substance called matter that nobody has ever found. The whole premise of materialism is based on this stuff called matter, from which consciousness is derived. The materialists believe that matter, which nobody has ever found or experienced, gives rise to the mind that explores it. But the mind that explores this matter has never actually found that matter. So the consciousness-only model doesn't refer to anything outside our experience. But it can still explain all the observations that scientists make, but it explains them from the point of view of the mind, not from the point of view of matter. How could a mind that is a derivative of matter fully understand what matter is? Because the mind must be somehow a subset of matter, a limitation of matter. It is derived from matter. How could that limited mind ever understand the matter that gave rise to it? The parent can understand the child, but the child can't understand the parent. How could, if matter is unlimited, and it gives rise to the limited mind, how could the limited mind understand unlimited matter? It's an impossibility. How could the character in a movie ever know the screen as it really is? It can't, because the character in a movie is a limitation of the screen. Therefore, everything the character in the movie knows, it knows through the prism of its own limitations. How can Jane ever know Mary's mind? Jane is a limitation of Mary. So everything Jane knows is limited. She cannot know Mary. If mind has been derived from matter, like Jane is derived from Mary, how could that mind ever know what matter truly is? It's impossible.